Welcome to Rome, one of the oldest, most beautiful cities in the world. A city that, in itself, is an ancient historical relic full of famous architectural sites, archaeological finds, and engineering marvels. Established in 753 BC, Rome has stood the test of time. Although its population has varied dramatically, from over 1 million at the height of the Roman Empire to down around 30,000 at its lowest, and up to 4.4 million currently, Rome has been around for hundreds of generations. And despite its age, many of its ancient monuments still survive today. Rome is also the 12th most visited city in the world. Every year, millions of people visit Rome to see the historic city. In 2017, it's estimated that around 9.6 million internationals visited Rome, a number that's projected to continue to grow year over year. So, with this in mind, what infrastructure does this massive ancient city have to successfully provide transportation to both its citizens and its vast number of visitors? Rome has an array of various forms of public transportation and private transportation, as expected of most cities in the modern day. There's an airport, train system, tram system, a bus system, many footpaths, bicycles are an option, and a wide system of roads. All roads lead to Rome, after all. The real question, though, is how successful are the transit systems in place in Rome, and how can they be improved? That's what I will be covering in depth in this video, from the perspective of someone, well, a transportation engineer, visiting Rome. Before we get started, let's cover our bases. First and foremost, let me clarify the lens that I am writing this through so that my personal biases are made clear. As I said above, this evaluation comes from my personal experience and perspective visiting Rome. As an able-bodied young adult who lived in Rome for a month, basing this evaluation on my own experience has its limitations. I don't have the perspective of someone who is less capable of utilizing forms of transportation requiring physical exertion, nor do I have the perspective of a local resident. I'm also an engineering student. As such, I lack the knowledge and familiarity of a professional transportation engineer who has spent years studying transportation in Rome. This video is intended to evaluate transportation in Rome in the form of an approachable guide, a crash course of sorts. So at times, I simplify problems to accomplish that goal, and for comedic effect. Please note that these biases are present, and simplifications are made not to be reductionist, but so the information fits the scope of this video. Okay, now let us define some important terminology, just in case you don't know any transportation engineering lingo, or you need a refresher. For the purposes of this video, we are going to touch on these ideas. Wayfinding, which describes information systems designed to guide people through physical spaces. Modes of transportation, which are the various methods of transportation available in a given place. Infrastructure, which is the physical and organizational structures of the built environment in which modes of transportation operate. And for Rome's infrastructure specifically, we are going to talk mostly about how Rome's network, a term that pertains to a location's complex system of transportation routes, and its pavement structure, which, as it sounds, refers to the way pavement is built, impact the viability of different aspects of its transportation system. Alright, with the groundwork laid, let's go to Rome. Okay, so we've just touched down in Rome and have arrived at the airport. Chances are you flew into Fiumicino, also known as Leonardo da Vinci International Airport, FCO for short. Keep an eye out for signs telling you where to go, and you should be fine for getting through customs. Everything is very smooth and clearly labeled. Be careful that you go through the correct underpass archway and stand in the right line, but it won't be hard. The airport itself is well laid out, or at least comfortably from the perspective of an American traveling to Rome. Getting through the airport should be a breeze, and all because the wayfinding within the airport is made very easy. There are clear signs everywhere, and an intuitive layout makes for easy navigation. However, getting to where you're staying from the airport is a trial in itself. As easy as the wayfinding is within the airport, outside it's a whole different story. It almost feels like the designers wanted you to get to the airport and just never leave. When attempting to depart the airport, wayfinding becomes quite challenging. The signage is honestly quite confusing as a non-Italian speaker, as while in the airport there is a lot of English, but outside there is significantly less. Trying to navigate the process of getting a cab took over an hour for me personally, because while there are many cabs, the process of hailing them and such here was unclear to me, and as a foreigner, I did not really know what their customs were. I tried to use the app My Taxi, essentially Rome's combination of Lyft and a taxi service, but for whatever reason, they pick up at the departures level rather than the arrivals one, which means to get there, you have to go back up an escalator into the airport. I missed multiple attempts at getting a taxi because of this. My classmates, for the most part, used the train system, and I would recommend that. It's much cheaper. The train to Rome is only €8 compared to the €48 a taxi costs, and very straightforward. The wayfinding is excellent. Plus, if you get confused, you can take your time and you aren't under any conversational pressure like you would be with a taxi driver. I'll cover the train and bus systems more in depth later when we get to talking about transportation in the city itself. As for the functionality of the airport, I think it performs quite well. While getting a taxi was difficult as a foreigner who did little to any research beforehand on how to go about doing so, the airport's internal wayfinding is excellent. It is well designed, easy to navigate, and signage is appropriately distributed. Alright, we've made it to where we are staying, and now it's time to see the sights. Maybe we're a little hungry and want to try that famously delicious, authentic Italian cuisine. Well, there's now a couple of issues we have to solve. First, where are we going? And I'm not going to help you with that. I'm an engineer, not a food critic or a sommelier. And then, how far is it? And as a follow-up, the all-important, how are we going to get there? Well, let's evaluate the options, shall we? We are going to cover this one first, because I want to get this out of the way immediately. As a visitor, do not drive in Rome. For you, driving is by far the most atrocious mode of transportation in Rome. Some of this is likely by design to avoid having tourists drive in the city, though I honestly don't really know why people who live in Rome drive, because from what I can tell, it's not really worth it for them either. That's not to say that there aren't upsides to driving. It's often faster than other forms of transportation, and it affords privacy and autonomy, but the downsides are numerous as well. Now, a few disclaimers. This is an area where I am quite biased as I am not a local, and thus do not have the experience to explain why driving may be worth it if you live in Rome. While I did live there for a month, my program was designed so that I would not have to have a private vehicle while I was there, and so at no point did I face any pressures that might cause someone to decide to drive. And thus, I did not attempt to drive anywhere in Rome either. That's not to understate all the difficulties that come with trying to use a car in Rome though. First off, from the perspective of money, it's just not worth it. The rental itself is not all that expensive, but gas is. Average gas prices in Rome while I was there were €1.64 per liter, which is over $7 a gallon. Also, Rome has something called ZTLs, which are essentially automated systems designed to limit traffic within the historical city center. There are ZTL permits available to residents, but if you are a non-resident, you literally cannot get a permit, which means you have to pay a fine for every time you drive in a ZTL. And I mean a fine, not a toll, so like €65, plus possibly a €45 fee for violating a traffic law if your rental provider feels like it. Looking at the map, this essentially means you cannot drive anywhere within the city center, which is where basically everything you would want to see and everywhere you would want to eat is. And that's just the cost. Rome has very little available parking, which means that, for the most part, people just park illegally wherever they want, which often turns high-traffic walking areas into parking lots. This is made worse by the lack of enforcement of existing parking laws. Additionally, Rome's network is very dense and organic in nature, so it is full of tiny roads that follow no street grid pattern. Most of the roads came about before the advent of cars and are meant for walking, so their pavement structure is designed as such. These roads are paved with Sanpietrini, which are little square cobblestones with small gaps between them so that the water can drain when it rains. The Sanpietrini aren't made to withstand the weight of cars, so the paths are rapidly deteriorating over time. Additionally, these roads are almost always filled with pedestrians, and are very narrow to the point that they are virtually undrivable, which is exacerbated by people parking illegally in random places. The only way renting a car in Rome is maybe worth it is if you are planning to visit many things in the countryside where public transit cannot reach it well. But basically anything that might attract a fair number of tourists has public transportation that goes to and from it. So I would still recommend against it, especially if you are staying in the historic city center, since you will need somewhere to park your vehicle. And you're unlikely to be able to even drive it to where you're staying because of ZTLs. So yeah, driving in Rome as a visitor kinda sucks, and you should not drive when you come here. That's not to say that there aren't valid reasons to drive in Rome as a local, but as a visitor, definitely steer clear. Okay though, enough bitching about it. Good engineers propose solutions when they identify problems. So what's the solution to the transportation conundrum posed by cars in Rome? There are many problems to solve, all of which are difficult from both a time perspective and a money investment perspective. To recap, there's little to no parking, gas costs a lot, the pavement structure is not designed for cars in most places, there are too many pedestrians, the city is over-congested with vehicles, and the network is dense and organic and hard to navigate, so traffic flow is pretty terrible. There's also the matters of ZTLs, which exist to reduce traffic, but that's not an infrastructure issue, it just makes it more expensive and difficult to drive in Rome. Which, to be fair, is exactly the point. The ZTLs, to some extent, really hit the nail on the head in my opinion. Rome as a city is, in a way, a giant historical site, and thus as an engineer, preserving that about the city has to be a priority when trying to improve its infrastructure. In Rome, there is little room to equip the city with the assortment of infrastructure, such as parking lots, roads paved for vehicles, etc., it would need to be able to support private cars as a mode of transportation. For Rome to improve this infrastructure, it would need to make some trade-offs and destroy some old stuff to make way for the new, which I don't necessarily think is a bad decision, so long as they're careful about it. It is less than ideal, but there are no ideal solutions to this problem really. To avoid that though, Rome attempted to do the only other sensible thing, reduce driving in the city via ZTLs. I think this method was not extreme enough to really be effective though. I think in order for Rome to solve the problem, they would have to go all the way and outlaw driving specifically on roads that are paved with Sanpietrini, and create roadblocks all around the city to prevent cars from driving on these type of roads as well. They already did something similar for various Sanpietrini bridges around Rome, because they recognized that the bridges would not stand up to the amount of load being placed on them by vehicles. And this problem is also true for the streets, so they should act accordingly. Not only is this a good solution from a sustainability perspective, it also reduces the amount of traffic congestion in the city by creating fewer drivable roads, and thus making it far less practical to drive places within the city. People will be able to drive through Rome, but not really stop within it. This also allows for the bus system to mostly continue to function as it is, as for the most part, the buses don't use the Sanpietrini roads. And it makes walking in the city a far more enjoyable and less dangerous experience. However, this solution would be very difficult for Rome to enact, as they struggle to get things done from a political standpoint, and it would upset many locals, as it would limit driving in the city to the major paved roads, which dramatically restricts its effectiveness. Additionally, it would make it significantly more difficult for non-able-bodied people to get around the city. So while it's a good hypothetical solution, there are definitely nuances that detract from its practicality. I think it would make for an overall better transportation experience in Rome for the most part, if Rome could pull it off, but it is quite extreme. In combination with the ZTLs, it would reduce traffic by making other forms of transportation clearly better than driving in many contexts, and traffic flow would get better in Rome as a result. That, I think, is largely inarguable. But is it the best solution? I'm not so sure. Maybe it would be best for Rome to tear down some old buildings and lose some historical preservation for the practicality of continuing to be a functioning modern city. Any way you slice it, though, Rome needs some significant changes to deal with the transportation issues that are currently created by driving in the city. And none of those changes are great options. Ah yes, walking. The oldest form of transportation, and in many cases the most effective, especially in Rome. Rome is a city built in a time when walking was the only transportation option available to the majority of its citizens. And as such, it is a beautiful city to walk. And as long as you don't mind the legwork, you can get most places in a reasonable amount of time. Plus, you get to slow down and enjoy the sights, smells, and sounds of the city. As a visitor, there aren't many downsides to walking in most contexts. Yes, it is slower than some of the other options for longer distances, and you might end up gaining weight if you're like me because the increased exercise you get isn't enough to offset the many times that you get distracted because you smell something delicious and have to stop for a taste. But for the most part, walking is a great way to traverse the city. When I was there, I spent the vast majority of my travel time walking. I walked upwards of 150 miles while I was in Rome. I basically walked whenever possible. As long as it took less than an hour to get somewhere, I would probably choose to walk it because, well, why not? It's a great way to see the city and get where you're going at the same time. Plus, you are traveling slow enough that if you make a wrong turn, you have time to stop, reorient, and get going back in the correct direction, which is useful as a visitor in Rome, since its transportation network is very dense and organic and thus hard to navigate. There are several issues with walking, though. First off, it requires a certain level of physical fitness to walk miles and miles, which means it does not work for everyone. Also, it's often slower than other forms of transportation, which means that it will take more time to get places. This is fine as a visitor, and almost an advantage, I would argue, but a much bigger deal as a local going about their busy day-to-day life. I think the biggest issue with walking, though, is one that relates to our previous topic closely. Because Rome is such a problematic city to drive in, it becomes quite stressful for pedestrians as well. Let me explain what I mean. When walking about Rome, there will be many times that you are walking on a cobblestone street and some car is angrily revving their engine and honking at you because they're trying to drive through this narrow-ass alley of a street that was not intended for driving in the first place. Sorry, can you tell that Rome's automobile situation frustrates me? Or there will be a scooter driver that is flying down that same alley like they think they're Evel Knievel, and they honestly don't care at all that they might hit someone. Okay, we got a little dramatic there, but my point is that the biggest issue with walking in Rome is how poorly Rome's network and infrastructure supports driving. Dealing with cars as a pedestrian is really frustrating, and I'm sure it's just as frustrating for local automobilists who are trying to get where they need to be quickly to have to deal with the swarms of pedestrians that crowd Rome's hive-like network. There are other issues with walking. For example, waiting for the crosswalks takes abysmally long, and the crowds can be quite restricting. But the problem is really caused by the fact that for cobblestone streets, roads and sidewalks are one and the same. So, walking isn't perfect and can be stressful, but I think the largest problem with walking in the city is caused by poor traffic management. If the solution of removal of cars from San Pietrini paved streets I mentioned earlier in the driving segment were implemented, plus maybe a blanket increase in crosswalk frequency, I think Rome would be an even more fantastic walking city. And there's evidence reducing cars would improve walking conditions. We also visited Venice on our trip, where there are no wheeled vehicles, just walking paths and canals for boats, and it was an absolute pleasure to traverse the city by foot. Although Rome is larger, and thus it is impractical to be a walking-only city, I think the same principles can be applied to the city center, where the roads are not designed for cars in the first place. However, as I mentioned above, removal of cars from San Pietrini streets definitely creates problems. It makes transportation less stressful in many ways, but would make getting from place to place much slower. The real issue is that pedestrian walking paths should not double as roads, but because Rome's transportation network is as dense as it is, the only way to easily fix this is to remove cars from cobblestone roads, which is less than ideal if you're a local trying to get from place to place quickly, or you are not physically able to walk large distances. Otherwise, we are back to the solution of tearing down old buildings to make way for new, better infrastructure. Wide paved streets with sidewalks and parking lots, etc. Which is in direct conflict with preserving Rome as a historical site. Bicycling is an interesting mode because it kind of splits the difference between driving and walking. It allows you the increased speed of a vehicle without the drawbacks of things like paying for gas and permits, weight, and width. We did some biking while in Rome, namely on the Appian Way, one of the earliest Roman roads. This was more a recreational trip than a transportation-focused one, but some of the principles that factored into the experience can still be applied. Biking in Rome can be quite effective as a mode of transportation, but personally I would avoid it and would not recommend it for a couple of reasons. First, comfort. The cobblestone roads are fairly bumpy, and it can be a lot of strain on your arms, shoulders, and joints to ride on them. You can see this in the footage taken from the GoPro I wore during the bike ride. See how shaky it is? This, combined with the nightmare traffic in Rome, and the complete and utter lack of bike lanes and bike paths, make the city quite unfriendly and often dangerous to cyclists. Plus, as a traveler who likely does not know the city particularly well, it is stressful to navigate by bike as again, you suffer from the issue of having less time to find the correct turn within Rome's complex and intricate street network, and to react in time if you miss where you're going. As a local, it is likely a little better since you would know where you are going, but like with walking, you must be able-bodied to ride a bicycle. So already, those who can utilize this mode of transportation is limited. Bicycles also limit your use of your hands, so if you need to carry many things, they are likely not an option either. And as a single-person transportation vehicle, they require everyone who is traveling with you to have their own bicycle, and be capable of riding one. For Rome to become bikeable, they first need one major thing that every city needs to become bikeable, and that's bicycle paths and lanes, which is difficult in a place that does not even really have space to add more sidewalks. And yet, I don't think that adding bike paths and bike lanes would really do much for making bicycling a more effective way to travel throughout Rome, as, like with cars, bikes don't function well on cobblestone streets. While bikes can handle the streets and the streets can handle the bikes, which is much less true for cars, they aren't particularly comfortable, and the sheer number of pedestrians creates a logistical issue for anyone trying to travel with wheels through the crowded, narrow cobblestone streets. If bike lanes were also created on the cobble streets, and cars were removed from them as discussed above, I think it is possible for Rome to become a bikeable city. However, that brings us back to the issues caused by the dramatic sweeping change removing cars is, which I'm not going to rehash here because I already covered them in detail twice. I will point out though how frustrating it is that so many of Rome's transportation issues stem from having to accommodate automobiles. it definitely makes removing automobiles from San Pietrini streets a more attractive solution. On bicycles, though, I definitely think that it would be great if Rome installed bike lanes and paths for the ease and safety of cyclists and pedestrians, but without sweeping changes to the infrastructure of the entire city, which is incredibly destructive and impractical. Rome will never be a particularly ideal place for bicycles. Workable? Maybe, but ideal? Definitely not. Alright, we have a few modes left here, all of them involving the public transit system. Let's start with buses. The first time I rode on a bus in Rome was on the third day I was there, after a long multi-mile walk touring Rome's neighborhoods. Coming to Rome, I had heard a lot of mixed reviews, things like, the bus just doesn't show up on time, and they don't actually operate on a schedule, and if you want to ride the bus, expect to wait like 45 minutes for it to come. But in my experience, that was not the case at all. Don't get me wrong, the bus was usually a handful of minutes late, but it was never extreme enough to mess up my plans, and it was more or less as consistent as any of the American bus systems. And so, bus ended up being the most common mode of vehicular transportation I used in Rome, for several good reasons. First off, the bus runs almost everywhere there is a main road, and as long as you are reasonably within the city limits, it comes quite often. There are normally multiple routes that can get you where you are going, and the wayfinding is quite intuitive for anyone with experience with buses in US cities. Just pull out your handy Google Maps equipped smartphone, find the bus number and stop you need, wait a couple minutes, and you're on your way. My one gripe in this regard is that ease of wayfinding is quite reliant on outside information like a smartphone. That is to say, the signage at the bus stops is not super helpful. But this was not surprising, as wayfinding when using buses in the US is also quite reliant on outside information. The bus system uses little credit card-sized laminated paper tickets that cost €1.50 and are sold basically at every convenience store and tobacco shop, of which there are many. And the best part is, these tickets also work for the tram and the metro. But wait, there's more! One ticket, once validated, grants you 100 minutes of travel time on any of these three transit systems for no additional charge. To validate your ticket, stick it into the little yellow machine you see on the screen, and it will timestamp your ticket and spit it back out to you in a matter of seconds. I know I'm starting to sound like an infomercial, which is hopefully making you, as an intelligent viewer, wary. So yes, like all things, there are a couple of downsides to the bus system. First, not all buses have air conditioning, which may not seem like a major issue, but trust me, in a hot, muggy city like Rome in the summer, it is. And those that do often need stronger AC. What do I mean by that? Well, because the bus system is so fantastic, depending on where you're going, the bus can get very crowded. So crowded that you literally can't move your arms, and every time the bus goes over a bump, you end up touching a far greater surface area of a sweaty stranger than you have ever wanted to. So warning, if you are claustrophobic, the buses may not be for you. With this many people, there's also the concern of pickpockets and people groping you, and other such unsavory things, which is definitely not fun. On crowded buses, you definitely need to be hyper aware of your surroundings, which can be very stressful, and when it is as crowded as I described, even that may not be enough to protect you with the limited mobility you have. The bus was super crowded when we went to see a Roma soccer match, and it was not fun. Because on top of the close quarters, when there are that many people combined, they radiate a lot of heat. So much heat that the air conditioning on the bus literally cannot keep up. Also, make sure you validate your ticket. I cannot emphasize this enough. It can be difficult to shove through the people to validate it, but if you don't, you will regret it. Being caught without a validated ticket will run you a steep fine of €50, and they don't give warnings. My class almost missed our train to Venice because a couple of my classmates forgot to scan and fare enforcement happened to check our bus. Luckily our train was delayed, but still, validate your ticket. So, if you can deal with the crowding, the bus is a great way to travel longer distances in Rome. It will get you where you're going, is cheap, and is quite compatible with other forms of public transit, which we'll get to in a sec. Now again, here I must remind you that I am not a local, and so there may be negative aspects of the bus system I did not encounter in the month I was there. I use the bus to travel mostly major routes, so I can't speak on the fringes of the bus system. In my experience though, the buses of Rome are already pretty great. But how can they get better? Well, the biggest problem is crowding, and the best way to reduce that is simply to run more buses. We visited the Metro Line C construction site on our trip, and beforehand we attended an informative presentation about the project. They gave their number estimates for how many people the Metro would be able to transport based on 6 persons per square meter, which in my opinion is just ridiculous. A square meter is absolutely tiny for 6 people. That's approximately 1.5 square feet per person, which is about 15 inches by 15 inches box per person. I'm a small guy, and my shoulders are about that wide. All this is to say, I think they should plan for more space per person. If they ran more buses, there would be less crowding, and although that costs the city more money that Rome may or may not actually have, I think it would be money well spent to increase the comfort of its inhabitants, if they can accomplish it. Also, if they were to implement the car limits that we have been discussing, there would be more people using transit and also less cars, so there would be space for more buses on the roads. However, again, this is all easier said than done, and while it is great in theory, in reality it is rarely that easy. Okay, so I've decided to group these last two modes together, because although I acknowledge they are somewhat different, it is more useful to compare them directly than to talk about them individually due to how similar they are. So, going in order, the Metro is a sometimes underground, sometimes above ground transit system that operates on rails, rather similar to the light rail in Seattle. It accepts the same tickets as the buses do, is lined with seats, and is normally several cars long. The Metro is very consistent and fast, but it's not very widespread in where it can get you. As of now, there are only 2 complete Metro lines, A and B, and a third one under construction, Line C. The Metro comes every couple minutes, which is quite convenient, and because each track is exclusive to one Metro line, it is easy to get on the right one, something that can be somewhat challenging at times with the buses. We rode the Metro a couple times, to the Appia Antica, to Ostia Antica, and to the Aqua Claudia Park, and every time it was smooth sailing. The tram is quite similar. In fact, by definition, the only difference between a tram and other railed vehicles is the type of tracks it runs on. If I were to describe riding the tram, I would describe it as riding on a bus that is attached to tracks. We only rode the tram once, as there is a very small tram system in Rome, but it does its job admirably. Again, it accepts the same types of tickets as the bus and the Metro, and the 100-minute span mentioned earlier applies across all 3 through infinite transfers. If the tram is the shortest way between you and where you're going, it's a good option. There are a couple of drawbacks of the tram specifically though. First, it is more limited in its reach than other forms of transit, and it's also significantly slower and less frequent than the Metro. If you're choosing between bus, Metro, and tram, I would likely pick Metro first, and then depending on how lucky you're feeling, bus. The Metro is the fastest and the most consistent, but as I've said, limited in its reach. This means that it is somewhat unlikely for the Metro to be the most direct route between places. There are stations where both the Metro stops and the train stops though, which can be really useful for connecting routes. The tram is just a slower, more infrequent Metro, and buses are not incredibly consistent. Plus they are often more crowded because they are notably smaller. However, the bus system has the farthest and most widespread reach, and thus can get you almost anywhere you want to go. As for solutions and how they can be improved, I don't have a ton to say for the Metro. The Metro is well designed and functions effectively. Rome just needs to continue to expand it where possible, which they are actively working on via the Metro Line C project, and maybe Rome should run the metro more often to cut down on crowding during peak times. The tram is a nest of worms though. Because the tram lines intersect the roads, they exacerbate the road traffic problems. To be honest, the tram system is small enough that Rome is probably better off without it. To just replace it with more buses would probably be the best decision. Although, if they were to implement the traffic restrictions I discussed at the beginning, this may not be a problem. However, it is definitely not worth maintaining in my opinion. Better to replace it and put the maintenance resources elsewhere. Alright, we finally made it to the last mode. Trains. Trains in Rome is kind of a misnomer because it's really trains between Rome and other places of interest. That said, the train system in Italy is very nice. We rode a high-speed train to and from Venice, and it was very enjoyable as an experience, both directions. To describe the train in Italy, picture your ideal plane ride. Or, just look at the screen. Comfy chairs, plenty of legroom, tables to get work done, charging ports, free Wi-Fi, overhead bins for your luggage, bathrooms. The list goes on. There's even an entire car on the train dedicated to dining that you can go order food from. All the while, you can sit and enjoy the scenery of the beautiful Italian countryside. The high-speed trains are priced on the high end. A train from Rome to Venice can run you close to €100. But the regular trains are much more reasonably priced. It's only €8 for a train from the airport. I really have no gripes with the train system. It functioned as desired every time I used it. The only thing I have to say is be careful in the train station, as they are quite big and it can be easy to get lost or overwhelmed. Wayfinding is not terrible, but because of their size and the many different trains coming and going, there can be a bit of information overload with the multitude of signage and different directions you can go. Make sure you give yourself a little extra time to figure things out, kind of like when you go to a new airport for the first time. Outside of wayfinding, the train stations are quite nice, and many have some shopping and dining locations in them. So, if you do have extra time, make sure you explore a little. All I have to say here is, utilize the train system for traveling about Italy. It's amazing. It's functional, clean, spacious, approachable, and intuitive. I honestly have nothing bad to say about my experience with the trains. Just give yourself the time to go slow and read signage. Wayfinding in a hurry is a sure way to detract from an otherwise pleasant experience. Whew! Alright, that's my overview of transportation in Rome. The intent of this video was to make transportation in Rome less daunting for future visitors using my personal experience, and I did my best to highlight the shortcomings of my personal experience to avoid spreading generalizations, oversimplifications, and misinformation. So, with that in mind, I hope you found it informative, helpful, and hopefully not too long and boring. Rome is an ancient city where modern technology and infrastructure struggle to function within the confines of beautiful structures built for a different time. And so its transportation systems can be hit or miss. Despite this, Rome has a pretty decent foundation of effective modes of transportation, and while suboptimal, there are a handful of good solutions that Rome could implement to greatly increase the effectiveness of its transportation systems. It definitely has the building blocks of good transportation with how easy and approachable wayfinding in Rome is. However, the biggest issues with transportation in Rome are caused by automobiles, and unless they make some compromises to solve those issues, they will not be able to make much improvement. Working around Rome's complicated network and existing pavement structure is quite challenging, but if Rome can bring its worst modes of transportation up to par with its best, it would be a lovely place to travel in. In case you missed anything, or you're feeling a little overwhelmed with information, the timestamps for each section are in the description. But in case you don't want to go back, here's the overall strategy I recommend while traveling in Rome. Avoid driving. Instead, walk wherever possible and utilize the transit systems available for traveling longer distances, because they all work quite well. Bicycling is an option, but I'd recommend against it. Google Maps is your friend. Although it might not know exactly when the bus is coming, it will get you from place to place. And last but not least, eat lots of gelato. I recommend stracciatella at Frigidarium. Oh, and for the love of God, validate your ticket!